The first time Grace Bennett saw Luke Donovan's house, she was already inside it, standing in her mother's old blue dress with frost still clinging to the hem, wondering if a person could die of fear without a single wound on her body. Somewhere behind her, miles back down the frozen road, her family was praying over a debt that no longer belonged to them. And somewhere ahead of her, down a dark hallway lit by a single lamp, stood the man the whole valley called heartless, the man she had married 2 hours earlier, in a ceremony so quick it barely felt real. The house itself seemed to be holding its breath around her, tall ceilings and long shadows, the smell of wood smoke and old leather settling over everything like dust that had never been disturbed. She would remember that first night for the rest of her life, not because of anything cruel that happened, but because of how silent it was, how the silence itself felt like a held breath, as though the house had been waiting a very long time for someone to finally walk through its door, and it did not yet know whether to trust her. Grace did not know then that she would come to love that silence and the man who lived inside it, but on that first night she knew only fear and the aching memory of her father's hands shaking as he signed away her daughter's future to save his land. Grace had grown up on the Bennett Ranch in Sweetwater, Wyoming, 3 generations deep in a struggle that had finally, after years of drought and debt, reached its breaking point. She had spent her whole life working beside her father and her 2 younger brothers, mending fences with hands that had long since forgotten what softness felt like, rising before the sun to milk the cows, and falling asleep most nights, still smelling of hay and horse sweat. She remembered summers when the creek ran so low the cattle had to be walked 3 miles for water, and winters when her mother stretched a single ham through 2 weeks of meals without ever once complaining aloud. When the bank sent its final warning that winter, she had watched her father age 10 years in a single afternoon, his shoulders curling inward at the kitchen table, as though the weight of 3 generations had finally settled directly onto his spine. Then came the offer no one expected. Luke Donovan, a wealthy rancher who kept to himself so completely that most of the valley had never heard him speak more than a sentence at a time, sent word that he would pay every dollar the Bennetts owed in full, on one condition: he wanted Grace as his wife. Her father had refused at first, pride flaring hot even in defeat, pacing the kitchen floor and muttering that no Bennett had ever sold a daughter for land. But Grace had made the choice before he could finish arguing. She remembered saying only this, quiet and steady though her chest was breaking apart inside her, that she would rather give away her own future than watch her brothers lose the only home they had ever known. She believed, walking through that gate, that she was sacrificing herself to a cold stranger who wanted a wife the way a man wants a good horse or a sturdy fence, useful, obedient, and nothing more. She was wrong, though it took her weeks to understand how wrong. Luke did not raise his voice. He gave her a room of her own the very first night and told her plainly she was welcome to lock the door if it eased her mind, then walked back out to the barn and did not return until well past midnight. In the weeks that followed, Grace watched him the way a person studies an animal they do not yet trust, cautious, quiet, keeping a careful distance, even as curiosity pulled her closer. What she found surprised her every time. He rose before dawn and worked harder than any hand on his own land, mending fences with the same rough patience her own father had shown. And in the evenings, he sat by the fire reading old letters he never once shared aloud. He never spoke a harsh word to man or beast, not even the young coat that nipped at his sleeve every morning at the trough. And he was almost unbearably alone. No letters that arrived for him, no visitors who stayed past supper, a grand house that felt hollow at its center, as if something essential had been removed from it long ago and never replaced.
One evening, Grace found him standing frozen in the doorway of a room at the end of the hall, a room she had never seen him enter, and when she asked what was inside, his face changed in a way that frightened her more than his silence ever had, the color draining slowly from it, as though she had asked him to relive something unbearable. He said it was nothing, and walked away faster than she had ever seen him move, boots striking hard against the floorboards. And Grace stood alone in the hallway with her heart pounding, certain now that whatever coldness the valley spoke of, it was not the absence of feeling in this man, but a wound so deep he could not bear to let it breathe. It was Martha, the ranch cook who had known Luke since he was a boy no taller than a fence post, who finally gave Grace the truth. One afternoon, while they shelled peas together on the back porch, the sun warm on their hands and the hens clucking lazily in the yard. Martha told her that Luke's father and Grace's own grandfather, old Thomas Bennett, had once been closer than brothers, riding west together as young men with nothing but a wagon, 2 rifles, and a promise to look after each other's kin no matter what storms came. She said that during a terrible winter decades before, Thomas had ridden through freezing rain to warn Luke's father of danger bearing down on his land, very likely saving his life and the lives of everyone under his roof. Luke's father never forgot that debt, and on his deathbed he made his son swear that if the Bennett family ever fell into ruin, the Donovan name would rise to meet them, whatever the cost. Luke had carried that promise silently for nearly 10 years, watching from a distance, refusing to interfere until there was truly nothing left for the Bennetts to lose, because his father had also taught him that pride was a fragile thing, and a man deserved the dignity of fighting for his own land as long as he could. When Grace heard this, something inside her chest cracked open, not from anger, but from a grief and gratitude so tangled she could not separate them. She had believed she married a stranger. She had, in fact, married a man who valued a dead man's promise more than his own comfort, and who had never once expected her love in return for keeping it. Knowing the truth should have made things easier between them, but instead it made Grace afraid in a new way, afraid that whatever tenderness was growing in her heart was built on nothing sturdier than debt and duty. That fear found its voice one gray afternoon when a stranger rode onto the property, a well-dressed man named Everett Cole, who represented a railroad company eager to buy up land through the valley, Donovan land included, at any price Luke would name. Cole smiled too easily and spoke too smoothly, the kind of man who measured every handshake by what it might later cost him, and Luke turned him away with
in a handful of cold words that carried more warning than any shout could have. That night, for the first time since her wedding day, Grace heard him speak with real anger in his voice, warning Cole's man off his property from the porch, his jaw set hard against the darkness. She realized with a chill that being married to Luke Donovan meant being tied to enemies she had never chosen, men who would not simply walk away because he told them no. Frightened and overwhelmed, Grace found herself standing in the kitchen that night with her hands pressed flat against the table, staring at the grain of the wood as though it might offer her an answer. When Luke came in and asked quietly what was wrong, something in her finally broke loose. She told him she did not know who she was anymore, a wife in name only, a debt paid in a woman's body, caught between a husband who barely spoke and a world outside that wanted to tear apart everything he had built. "I did not ask to be part of your war," she said, her voice shaken, "and I do not know if I can keep giving pieces of myself to a marriage I never chose." Luke did not raise his voice back at her. He only looked at her for a long moment, something raw moving behind his eyes, and said that he had never once believed she owed him anything beyond what she had already given, and that if she wanted to leave, truly leave, he would not stop her, and he would still consider the family's debt paid in full. It was the first time Grace saw him not as a wall, but as a man standing on the other side of one, and it frightened her more than his silence ever had, because it meant the choice was now entirely her own. She almost left. For 2 days she packed nothing and said even less, walking the fence lines alone with her thoughts, the wind pulling at her shawl as she passed the same posts Luke had mended only that week. She remembered her mother's tears, her father's shame, her brother's frightened faces the morning she rode away from them, and she wondered whether a woman could build a life on gratitude alone, or whether gratitude eventually curdled into something closer to resentment. But she also remembered the way Luke had looked at her in the kitchen, not like a man defending his property, but like a man terrified of losing the one soft thing that had wandered into his hardened life. On the third morning, she found him in the barn before dawn, exactly where she always found him, brushing down the mare with slow, even strokes, his breath fogging in the cold air. Instead of walking past, she sat down on an overturned bucket beside him and asked him to tell her about the room at the end of the hall. He set down the brush slowly, and though his voice trembled at first, he told her about his younger sister, a girl who had died of fever when she was 7 years old, a girl who used to follow him everywhere across the ranch, calling him her shadow, and how her death had taught him far too young that love could be taken without warning, which was why he had spent years afterward refusing to feel much of anything at all. Grace realized then that she was not the only one who had been afraid to trust this marriage, and that choosing to stay was not weakness, but the bravest thing either of them had done yet. Winter tightened its grip on Sweetwater not long after, and it was that winter which finally proved to Grace, beyond any doubt, what kind of man she had married. Word came that her father had collapsed in the barn back home, his heart given out under years of worry, and in the chaos that followed, no one noticed that Daniel, her youngest brother, only 11, had slipped out into blizzard to search for a missing calf he believed he alone could save. By the time anyone realized he was gone, the storm had swallowed the whole valley in white, cold enough to kill a grown man in hours, let alone a child. Grace stood on the porch screaming her brother's name into wind that swallowed her voice whole, snow stinging her face until she could no longer feel it, and it was Luke who moved first, saddling his horse without a moment's hesitation while the hands begged him not to ride into a storm no man could survive. He looked at Grace only once before he left, his hand resting briefly against her cheek, the first time he had touched her with such tenderness. "Your family's blood saved my father's life once," he said, "and I would rather die searching for your brother than live comfortably knowing I let a promise die with me." Then he was gone into the white dark, swallowed by the storm within seconds, and Grace spent the longest night of her life on her knees beside her mother's bed, praying to a God she had nearly stopped speaking to, begging for the return of two men whose absence had taught her, all at once, exactly how much she loved them both. Dawn broke gray and merciless, and for hours there was no sign of either man, only endless white silence stretching toward the mountains, the world outside so still it seemed to have forgotten how to move. Grace stood at the window with her mother's hand gripped tight in her own, watching the horizon until her eyes ached, until she began to fear that hope itself was a foolish thing to hold on to, in a land that had already taken so much from her family. Then, just past midday, a shape appeared on the ridge, a horse walking slow and low-headed with exhaustion, and upon it, wrapped inside Luke's own coat, with only his small, frightened face showing, was Daniel, alive.
Luke had found him nearly 2 miles out, half frozen inside a rock outcropping, having given up hope of ever being found, and had carried him the whole way back through drifts that reached his horse's chest, guided only by memory and a stubborn refusal to return home with anything less than a living child. When Grace ran into the snow and pulled her brother into her arms, sobbing into his hair, she looked up at Luke still sitting atop his exhausted horse, lips blue with cold, hands barely able to hold the reins, and she understood with total clarity that this was no longer a marriage of debt or duty. This was a man who had risked everything, without hesitation, for a family that had become his own not by blood, but by choice. And Grace realized that choice was a far stronger bond than blood had ever been. Grace's father survived that winter, weakened but alive, and by the time the first green returned to the plains, something had settled permanently between Grace and Luke, something neither of them needed to name aloud because it lived plainly in every quiet evening spent side by side on the porch, watching the sun fall behind the mountains in long ribbons of orange and violet. Everett Cole and his railroad money eventually gave up on Donovan land, finding easier ground elsewhere, and the valley slowly stopped whispering that Luke Donovan had no heart, because they had all heard by then the story of a man who rode into a killing storm for a boy who was not his own blood. One evening, many months after the blizzard, Grace took Luke's hand and led him herself down the hallway to the room at its end, and together they opened the door, not to close it away this time, but to finally let the light in. Inside, a narrow bed still sat beneath a faded quilt, and a small wooden horse carved by careful, loving hands rested on the windowsill, exactly where it had been left years before. They sat together on the edge of that bed, and Grace wept quietly for the first time in nearly 2 decades, her shoulders shaking with a grief he had carried alone for far too long. And Grace held him the way she imagined his own mother once might have, gently, without judgment, simply present. "I am not afraid of you anymore," she told him, "and I have not been for a long time, and whatever grief you still carry, you do not have to carry it alone." Luke looked at her then with an expression she finally had a name for, one she never thought she would see on the face of the man the valley once called heartless, and it was love, plain and whole, and entirely hers. Spring came fully to Sweetwater not long after, painting the plains gold and green, wildflowers pressing up through soil that had spent so long frozen and forgotten. And Grace often stood at the same gate where she had first walked in as a frightened bride, only now she stood there by choice, watching Luke ride in from the fields with a smile that had once seemed impossible for him to wear. Their marriage, born from fear and sacrifice, had become something neither of them had dared to hope for on that first silent night, proof that love does not always begin with romance, and that the truest kind of love is often the kind earned slowly, through loyalty, through honest fear spoken aloud, and through the quiet, unwavering choice to keep showing up for another person, storm after storm, until two broken people become, at last, each other's home. If this story stayed with you tonight, if you held your breath through that blizzard or felt your heart break open in that small, quiet room, please consider subscribing to Desert Heart, where every week we bring you another story of the American frontier, of broken hearts finding healing, and of love proven not through easy beginnings, but through impossible choices. Tell us in the comments which moment moved you most, and share this story with someone who still believes in second chances. Ring the bell so you never miss the next journey into the heart of the Old West. The significant value in this story lies in its honest portrayal of how trust is built, not through grand declarations, but through small, repeated acts of honesty and presence, including the courage it takes to admit fear within a marriage rather than silently enduring it. It shows that loyalty carried across generations can shape and protect a family long after the original promise was made, and that grief, when finally spoken aloud, loses much of its power to isolate a person. The story also honors quiet heroism, a father's sacrifice, a young bride's courage to both accept and later question her circumstances, and a grieving man's willingness to risk everything for a family bound to him by honor rather than blood. At its heart, it reminds viewers that the strongest partnerships are not the ones without doubt, but the ones where both people choose again and again to stay and be truly known.